We shall see.
There are moments in life that split everything you have ever known into two clean halves, the before and the after. And if you have ever loved someone completely, if you have ever given another human being the best years of your existence, your youth, your mornings, your energy, your ambitions, your dreams, if you have ever reorganized your entire life around another person's happiness, their comfort, their future, and their success, then what you are about to hear is going to land somewhere very deep inside you. Because this is not simply a story about a marriage that ended. This is a story about a woman who was told, by the man she cooked for and prayed for and stood beside through every storm and every quiet season for more than 2 decades, that she no longer had value, that she was past her time, that she had become, in his words, expired goods. And then, he changed the locks. He packed her life into boxes like old furniture he no longer had use for, and handed those boxes to her at the front door, like she was a stranger, collecting a delivery. And then he walked back inside the house she had helped build, the house she had kept clean and warm, and filled with the smell of Sunday dinners and birthday celebrations, and the quiet hum of a woman holding absolutely everything together, and he closed the door behind him. He did not look back, not once, because in his mind, it was done. She was done. He had already begun writing the next chapter of his story, and she was not in it. The only problem with that plan, the only thing that David, in all of his careful, calculated, and deeply arrogant preparation to discard the woman who had been the very foundation of his life, had failed to consider, was that Margaret had been paying very close attention. For years, and what she had been quietly collecting, what she had been organizing and documenting and remembering with the kind of precise, unhurried focus of a woman who understood exactly what was being built and exactly what it was worth, was about to become the most powerful thing she never planned to use. Before we go any further into this story, I need you to hold 3 questions in your mind. Not because I am going to answer them right away, but because they are going to shape everything you are about to hear, and by the time this hour is over, you will understand exactly why each one of them matters. The first question is this: how does a 22-year marriage, built on shared sacrifice, shared finances, and 2 children raised together in the same home, collapse in a single conversation? And more importantly, who really saw it coming and chose to say nothing? The second question is one that sits at the center of this entire story. When a man replaces his wife with a younger woman and convinces himself, and everyone around him, that this is simply the natural evolution of his life, what does the wife do with her grief, with her anger, with the legal rights that 2 decades of partnership have quietly secured for her? And the third question, the one that changes absolutely everything once you understand it, is this: what had Margaret been building, quietly, deliberately, almost invisibly, in the years before David ever sat her down at that kitchen table? What had she seen coming long before he thought she had any idea? Stay with me, because those 3 questions are not separate threads. They are the same thread, and it leads directly to a courtroom, to a ruling that David's own attorney reportedly did not see coming, and to a chapter of Margaret's life that no one in their social circle, not even those closest to her, ever predicted she was capable of writing. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand what happened, you have to understand who Margaret was, not who she became after the divorce, not who she was forced to become by circumstances she did not choose, but who she was at her core before any of this began. Margaret Ellen Harris was born and raised in a mid-sized city in the American South, the second of 3 daughters in a household where work was a value, not a suggestion, and where women were expected to be capable in every direction at once, capable of holding a job, running a home, raising children, and supporting the people they loved without complaint and without recognition. She grew up watching her mother do exactly that, and she absorbed it the way children absorb the air around them, as simply the natural order of things. She graduated from a state university with a degree in education, and spent the first 7 years of her adult life as an elementary school teacher in the same district where she had grown up. By every account, she was exceptional at it. Her students' parents requested her classroom. Her colleagues described her as the kind of teacher who remembered every child's particular struggle and never let a single one fall through the cracks. She had a gift for organization, for seeing the whole picture, for understanding how pieces fit together in ways that others missed. Those qualities, as it would turn out, were going to matter enormously. But not yet. Because at 28 years old, Margaret met David. David Allen Hartley was 31 when they were introduced at a mutual friend's dinner party in the fall of what would have been a completely ordinary year in Margaret's life had the evening gone differently. He was charming in the particular way that men with ambition and confidence tend to be charming: attentive, quick to laugh, full of ideas about where he was going and what he intended to build. He was working in commercial real estate at the time, not at the level he eventually reached, but with enough momentum that the trajectory was clear to anyone paying attention. Margaret was paying attention. She always was. They dated for 2 years, married in a ceremony her mother described as the most beautiful she had ever seen, and settled into a life that, for the first decade, moved exactly the way both of them had imagined it would. 2 children came in those early years: a son, Tyler, and a daughter, Kayla, born 3 years apart. Margaret continued teaching for the first 4 years after Tyler was born, managing the logistics of 2 careers and 2 small children with the same organized efficiency that had defined her classroom. But as David's business began to grow, as the deals got larger and the hours got longer, and the demands of building something real began to press against the edges of what a 2-career household with young children could absorb, a conversation happened. It was not an argument. It was not even particularly dramatic. David said that someone needed to be available for the children in a way that his schedule simply would not allow, and that her salary, while meaningful, was not the financial engine that his commissions were becoming. And Margaret, who believed in the partnership they were building and trusted the man she had married, agreed to step back. She left the classroom, she came home, and she made a decision, perhaps without fully articulating it even to herself, to put everything she had into the infrastructure of their shared life. What that meant in practice was this: Margaret did not simply become a homemaker in the traditional sense of the word. She became the operational center of everything David's growing success required. She managed their finances. She handled the household accounts, the investment portfolios, the tax documents, the insurance policies, the property records. When David's business needed administrative support in its early years, and he could not yet afford to hire someone reliable, Margaret stepped in and handled it, learning the language of commercial real estate by necessity, cross-referencing contracts, corresponding with vendors, organizing the documentation that kept his LLC compliant and his partners satisfied. She was not an employee. She was not listed on the company letterhead. She was simply the person who made it possible for David to walk into every meeting looking like a man who had everything under control. Because behind him, a woman who received no public credit for any of it was ensuring that he did. She raised their children. She attended every school event, managed every pediatric appointment, drove every carpool, hosted every family gathering, maintained every friendship and family relationship that made their social life function. She was, in the words that her sister Carol would later use when describing her, the reason that household looked the way it did from the outside, the reason people admired the Hartleys, the reason David Hartley could afford to be the person he was presenting to the world. And for many years there was love in that arrangement. Real love, real partnership, a genuine sense of building something together that belonged to both of them. Margaret believed in what they had. She believed in David. That belief, for longer than she should have held on to it, was the thing that kept her from seeing clearly what had already begun to change. The shift, by most accounts, started about 5 or 6 years before the night David sat her down at the kitchen table and told her she was expired goods. It was gradual at first, the way all erosion is gradual, so incremental that you barely notice it, until one day you look around and the landscape no longer resembles what you remember. He became more absent, not just physically, though the late nights and the weekends consumed by business became more frequent, but emotionally absent in a way that was harder to name, and therefore harder to address. He stopped asking about her days. He stopped remembering the small things she told him. He began, in quiet and then less quiet ways, to make comments about her appearance, about her weight, about the clothes she wore, about what he described as her reluctance to keep up with the social circle his success was bringing them into. The comments were delivered with a kind of casual dismissiveness that was almost more damaging than open cruelty would have been, because they were framed as observations, as helpful feedback from a husband who wanted his wife to be her best self. But Margaret felt them for what they were. Her sister Carol knew this, because Margaret would call her after these conversations, not crying, never quite crying on those calls, but with a flatness in her voice that Carol recognized as the sound of a woman trying very hard to hold herself together. And then, about 3 years before the end, a woman named Tiffany entered the picture. Tiffany Cole was 26 years old when she was brought on as a junior associate at the commercial real estate firm that David had built into a respectable regional operation. She was ambitious, David told Margaret when he mentioned her in passing, and a fast learner. Margaret did not press. She was not a suspicious woman by nature. But she noticed things. The second cell phone that appeared, explained away as a business line. The evenings that stretched later than they used to. The way David laughed differently when he took calls in the other room. The cologne he started wearing again. The one he had worn when they were first dating, and that had slowly faded from his routines somewhere in the middle years of their marriage. She noticed all of it. She stored all of it in the way that organized, observant people store things they are not yet ready to confront. In a quiet place, neatly filed, waiting. Their youngest, Kayla, finished high school and left for college across the state on a Thursday in late August. By the following Saturday, David had already scheduled the conversation that would end their marriage. He had, it would later become clear, been waiting for exactly this moment. The empty nest, the clean break, the exit he had been planning while Margaret was still packing their daughter's dorm room supplies. The conversation happened on a Tuesday evening in September. Margaret had made dinner. She would remember that detail later with a particular kind of quiet irony, that she had cooked the meal, set the table, poured the water, and sat down across from the man she had given 22 years of her life to, entirely unaware that the seat she was sitting in was about to become the place where her previous life ended. David came home later than usual. He did not sit down immediately. He stood at the counter for a moment with his back to her, and when he turned around, his face had the expression of a man who had rehearsed what he was about to say. He had. He told her he had already spoken to an attorney. He told her he had been thinking about this for a long time. He told her that the marriage had run its natural course, that people grow in different directions, that he needed someone who matched where he was going. These were the words of a man who had scripted his exit carefully. But then he went off script. Then he said the thing that no attorney had told him to say, the thing that came not from calculation but from the particular cruelty of a man who had so thoroughly stopped seeing his wife as a full human being that he had forgotten to be afraid of her. He looked at Margaret across the dinner table and said, "Let's be honest. You're expired goods. I need someone who matches where I am now." Margaret did not throw anything. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. Those who know her well say this is consistent with who she is, that her composure in moments of extreme distress is not coldness but something more controlled, more deliberate, a kind of internal stillness that falls over her when things become very serious. She told him she needed time to process what he was saying. He told her he had already made arrangements and would be out of the house by the end of the week. He was not asking for her agreement. He had already decided. The conversation lasted less than 20 minutes. That was all it took to dismantle 22 years. He went upstairs. She sat at the table. And the words he had just said, expired goods, settled into her like something that had weight and temperature, something that was going to stay with her for a long time. Not because they broke her, but because, in a very particular way, they woke her up. Within 10 days, the locks on the house were changed. David moved Tiffany into a downtown apartment that, as Margaret would discover later, he had been renting for the better part of a year. He had already told several people in their social circle that the marriage had quietly fallen apart, that they had grown apart, that these things happen. He controlled the story from the first moment, moving quickly and efficiently to frame the narrative, before Margaret had even found her footing. She was, by that point, staying at her sister Carol's house, with 2 suitcases, and a phone that David had already removed from the shared plan. He had thought of everything. He had covered every practical angle. He had, or so he believed, left her with nothing to work with and nowhere to go. What he had not accounted for, what he had never once thought to consider, because he had spent the last several years looking at Margaret and seeing nothing of consequence, was the woman she actually was. What she actually knew, what she had actually been doing with the 22 years he had just dismissed as expiration. The night she arrived at Carol's house with those 2 suitcases, Margaret did not fall apart. Carol would later say that she had braced herself for it, had prepared the spare room and put clean towels out and kept tissues on the nightstand, expecting the collapse that seemed inevitable. What she found instead was her sister sitting at the kitchen table with a legal pad, a pen, and a pair of reading glasses, writing. Margaret wrote for 3 hours that first night. She wrote down every asset she could recall, every account, every property, every business loan document she had touched, every LLC filing she had reviewed, every tax return she had helped prepare, every wire transfer she had approved on David's behalf over the years. She wrote down names and dates and dollar amounts and account numbers from memory, cross-referencing details the way a woman who had spent 22 years managing the financial architecture of a household and a business can cross-reference them, with a precision that Carol found both astonishing and quietly devastating to witness. And when Margaret finally put down her pen at nearly 1 in the morning and looked up at her sister, what she said was not the sound of a woman who was defeated. It was the sound of a woman who had just realized the full extent of what she was owed. She said, "I need a very good attorney, and I need her by Friday." She called Sandra Michaels the next morning. Sandra Michaels had been practicing family law in their city for over 2 decades, and she had a reputation that was well known in the legal community for 2 specific things: her command of financial evidence in high-asset divorce cases, and her particular expertise in cases where one spouse had managed the household finances, while the other built a business that both of them, legally and factually, had built together. When Margaret sat down in her office and began describing the specifics of her marriage, the co-signed loans, the LLC documents, the business correspondence she had handled, the tax returns she had prepared, the property refinancing she had agreed to 3 years earlier, Sandra listened without interrupting for the better part of an hour. And when Margaret finished, Sandra put down her pen, looked across the desk, and said 4 words that Margaret would remember for the rest of her life. She said, "He made a mistake." What followed over the next several weeks was a process that looked, from the outside, like a woman quietly and privately trying to get through the early stages of a painful divorce. From the inside, it was something else entirely. Sandra and Margaret worked methodically through the documentation that Margaret had been living inside for 22 years, and what they found as they went deeper into the financial history of the Hartley marriage was a picture that David's attorney would later struggle considerably to explain. The co-signed loans alone told a significant part of the story. Over the course of the marriage, Margaret's name appeared on loan documents totaling well over $300,000, money that had been used directly to fund the growth of David's commercial real estate business. Her signature was on the original LLC formation documents. Her name appeared on the deed to the property that David considered his primary business asset. These were not technicalities. These were legal facts with direct financial implications, and they meant that the story David had been telling, that Margaret had contributed nothing to the business, that she had simply stayed home while he built something from nothing, was not only false in the moral sense, but provably, documentably false in the legal sense. Sandra brought in a forensic accountant named Richard Calloway, a man with 30 years of experience in exactly this kind of financial excavation, who came with a reputation for finding what people did not want found. Richard began with the tax returns, then the business accounts, then the personal accounts, then the credit lines, and what he found as he moved through the financial records of the Hartley marriage, layer by layer, with the meticulous patience of someone who had done this many times before, was a pattern that became clearer the further back he looked. Beginning approximately 14 months before David had told anyone about Tiffany, before he had made any mention to Margaret or their children or their social circle that his marriage was in any kind of difficulty, money had begun moving. Not dramatically, not in ways that would have flagged an obvious problem immediately, but consistently, carefully, in amounts and through channels that, taken individually, might have passed without notice. Taken together, as Richard laid them out in a timeline that covered 14 months of transactions, they told a story of a man who had been planning his exit long before he announced it. Hotel receipts billed to a business account for a property that had no business purpose. A wire transfer to the downtown apartment dated 14 months before the divorce was filed, at a time when David was still attending family dinners and telling Margaret that everything was fine. A second cell phone plan embedded in the company's operating expenses. According to legal experts familiar with divorce proceedings, using marital funds to finance an extramarital relationship constitutes the diversion of community property, assets that belong equally to both spouses. Sandra filed an amended complaint, the case that David's attorney had clearly expected to be a straightforward property division, a clean split of a long marriage, perhaps weighted in David's favor given his business ownership, was no longer that case. It was now a case involving allegations of financial concealment, the diversion of marital assets, and a pattern of deliberate deception that had begun more than a year before the marriage formally ended. David's attorney filed a response arguing that the transactions in question were legitimate business expenses. Sandra's response was to present Richard Calloway's analysis, which showed, line by line, why they were not. But there was something else, something Margaret had recalled during one of their early working sessions that Sandra had immediately identified as potentially the most significant piece of the entire case. 3 years before the divorce, David had approached Margaret about refinancing the family home. He described it as routine. Interest rates had shifted. It made financial sense to take advantage of a better rate. She simply needed to sign some documents at closing. Margaret, who trusted her husband and who had signed hundreds of financial documents over the course of their marriage, had signed. She had not scrutinized that particular closing package as carefully as she might have done something she was seeing for the first time. What Margaret had actually signed, as Richard Calloway's review made clear, was documentation that had subsequently been used to partially restructure the property into a business holding arrangement, a structure that, critically, had not been disclosed in David's initial financial affidavit to the court when the divorce proceedings began. Courts require full and complete financial disclosure from both spouses at the outset of divorce proceedings. This is not optional, and it is not a technicality. It is a legal obligation, and the penalties for failing to honor it can be severe. In some jurisdictions, a court may award the deceived spouse the entire value of a hidden or improperly disclosed asset as a form of judicial sanction. David had failed to disclose the restructured property arrangement. That failure, once documented by Richard Calloway and presented to the court through Sandra's amended filings, would prove to be the moment the entire case shifted. Meanwhile, David was moving through his new life with remarkable confidence. He and Tiffany were living together in the downtown apartment. He was continuing to operate his business. He had told his business partners and his wider social circle that the divorce was proceeding amicably, that he and Margaret had simply reached a point where they wanted different things, that it was nobody's fault. He was managing perceptions with the same deliberate control he had brought to every aspect of the exit he had planned. What he did not know, what he had no reason to suspect because he had genuinely never considered Margaret to be a threat, was how much evidence had already been gathered. He did not know about Richard Calloway's timeline. He did not know that Sandra had obtained, through the discovery process, subpoenas for the business accounts, the personal accounts, the credit line records, and the phone records. He did not know that Margaret had located, among her own carefully maintained files, printed copies of 17 separate emails from David's business contacts, emails addressed directly to Margaret by name, thanking her for handling invoices, confirming payment arrangements she had negotiated, acknowledging her role in managing vendor relationships that David had claimed, under oath in his initial filings, were managed entirely by his own staff. 17 emails, each one addressed to Margaret, each one describing work that she had done, decisions she had made, relationships she had managed, from her home office, without pay, without title, without recognition. Each one, a piece of evidence that directly contradicted the version of their marriage David had presented to the court. Sandra organized them chronologically, flagged the most significant, and added them to a document binder that was, by the time she finished, 847 pages long. She told Margaret when she handed it to her, "He spent 22 years letting you do the work without giving you the credit. Now the credit is going to follow the work, and he is going to have to sit in a courtroom and watch it happen." There was one final thing that Richard Calloway's analysis surfaced in the weeks before the hearing, and it was the piece that, more than any other single element of the case, told the clearest story about who David Hartley really was and what he had done. The affair with Tiffany had not started when David had implied it started, which was sometime after the marriage had already been struggling, a timeline that would have painted him as a man who had sought comfort outside a failing relationship. The financial record told a different story entirely. The hotel receipts, the apartment lease dated 14 months before the filing, the cell phone records, the wire transfers, they placed the beginning of David's relationship with Tiffany at a time when he was still actively participating in family life, when he was still attending Kayla's school events with Margaret, when he was still celebrating their wedding anniversary, when he was still, in every visible and social sense, a husband. He had not turned to Tiffany because his marriage was already broken. The evidence suggested strongly that his relationship with Tiffany was, at least in part, a reason the marriage broke. And that distinction, in the context of a legal proceeding where the diversion of marital assets was already in question, mattered enormously. Sandra brought everything together into a coherent, methodical, and devastating narrative. And on a cold Monday morning in November, Margaret walked into a courthouse in a navy blue dress and low heels, carrying a tote bag that contained her copy of the 847-page binder, sat down beside her attorney, and waited for the hearing to begin. The hearing was scheduled for 3 days. By the morning of the second day, it was clear to everyone in that courtroom that 3 days was going to be more than enough. David arrived on day one with his attorney looking precisely as confident as a man who had controlled every variable of a situation tends to look. He sat down, adjusted his jacket, and glanced across the room at Margaret, with the particular expression of a man who expects to be inconvenienced but not genuinely threatened. What David did not know, as he settled into his chair that morning, was that the first thing Sandra Michaels intended to do was introduce Exhibit A, a stack of financial disclosure documents, submitted by David at the outset of the proceedings, placed side by side with Richard Calloway's independent analysis of the same financial period, with every discrepancy highlighted and cross-referenced. The forensic accountant himself was present as an expert witness, prepared to walk the court through the full timeline of transactions, the apartment lease, the wire transfers, the undisclosed restructuring of the property, and the pattern of financial behavior the records revealed over the 14 months preceding the divorce filing. David's attorney opened with what had clearly been their intended strategy, a portrait of a marriage in which David had been the primary financial contributor, and Margaret had been a homemaker with limited involvement in the business or its finances. He was measured, professional, and entirely unprepared for what came next. Sandra introduced the 17 emails. She introduced the LLC formation documents bearing Margaret's signature. She introduced the loan agreements, the co-signed notes, the tax filings, the property deed. She introduced Richard Calloway, who took the stand and spent the better part of 2 hours walking the court through the financial history of the Hartley marriage, with the calm precision of a man who had done this many times and knew exactly how clearly the numbers spoke when you put them in the right order. David's attorney objected frequently in the early going. The judge sustained very few of those objections. On the afternoon of the first day, Sandra introduced the timeline of the affair, the hotel receipts, the apartment lease, the wire transfer records, and connected each item explicitly to the question of when marital assets had been diverted, and to what purpose. David's attorney argued that these were legitimate business expenses. Sandra asked Richard Calloway to explain, item by item, why each claimed business expense had no corresponding business purpose in the company's records. He did so, clearly, without hesitation. The courtroom was very quiet during that portion of his testimony. And then came the moment that people who were present in that room that day would later describe as the pivot point of the entire proceeding. The judge, a woman in her late 50s with a long record on the family court bench, and a well-established reputation for patience with financial complexity, and very limited patience for evasion, looked directly at David and asked him a question. She asked him whether any marital funds had been used to support a secondary personal relationship prior to the filing of divorce proceedings. David's attorney began to speak. The judge asked her to allow her client to answer the question directly. David looked at his attorney. He looked at Margaret. He looked back at the judge. And for 11 full seconds, 11 seconds that felt, by every account from those present, considerably longer than that, he said nothing at all. His attorney ultimately answered for him, with a carefully worded non-admission, but the silence had already spoken. The judge made a note. The hearing continued. By the end of the second day, David's attorney had shifted his entire posture, moving from offense to a kind of damage control defense that acknowledged some of the financial discrepancies while attempting to minimize their significance. It was too late for that. The picture had already been assembled in front of the court, piece by piece, with Margaret's 847 pages of documentation sitting behind every argument Sandra made. The judge took 1 day to deliberate. She issued her ruling on a Tuesday morning, 7 weeks after the hearing concluded. Margaret sat in the courtroom with Carol on one side of her and Tyler, her son, on the other. Kayla had driven back from college and was seated in the row directly behind them. When the judge read the ruling, Margaret kept her eyes forward and her hands still in her lap. She did not cry. She had promised herself she would not cry. The ruling was this. Margaret was awarded 50% of the business valuation, calculated at the point of its current worth, a number that reflected 2 decades of growth, that the court's findings explicitly acknowledged had been supported by Margaret's documented contributions. She received the family home. She received a substantial portion of the retirement and investment accounts accumulated during the marriage. The court ordered David to repay, with interest, the funds he had diverted to the apartment during the period when the financial record indicated marital assets had been used to support the affair. The court further ordered that David was responsible for a significant portion of Margaret's legal fees, citing the incomplete financial disclosure in his initial filings as the basis for that order. David's attorney filed for appeal within the week. The appeal was reviewed and denied. Carol cried when the ruling was read. Margaret squeezed her hand. Tyler put his arm around his mother's shoulders. Kayla, in the row behind them, leaned forward and pressed her cheek against the back of her mother's head, and did not say anything at all. She did not need to. The ruling said everything. And that evening, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, Margaret went home, to her home, with her name on the deed, and her name on the account, and her name on the life she had built, and was now, fully and legally keeping. And she sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and her sister, and let herself breathe. David Hartley walked away from the divorce with considerably less than he had entered the proceedings expecting to keep. He retained a diminished stake in the business. He kept the downtown apartment he had been renting for Tiffany, and he kept Tiffany, for a while. Those who remained in proximity to both of their lives in the year that followed would later observe that Tiffany's interest in David appeared to cool in noticeable proportion to the reduction in his financial position. This is not a detail that Margaret ever mentioned publicly. She did not need to. She had already moved on to something far more important than watching what happened to David. She was building the next chapter of her own story, and it was consuming every bit of her considerable attention and energy. In the months immediately following the divorce, Margaret did several things in a specific and deliberate order. First, she sat in the family home and allowed herself a period of honest grief. Not the suppressed functional grief she had been carrying through the legal proceedings, but the real thing, the grief of a woman who had genuinely loved a man for 22 years, and was mourning not just the marriage but the version of her life she had believed in, the partnership she had invested everything in, the future she had planned and now had to entirely reimagine. She gave herself permission to feel that. She did not rush past it. She did not perform recovery for anyone else's comfort. She sat with Carol. She talked to a therapist who she later described as one of the best decisions she made in that entire period. She called her children. She walked in the evenings. She let herself be sad without letting the sadness become her permanent address. And then, about 4 months after the divorce was finalized, she opened her laptop one evening and typed a question into a search engine that she had been turning over in her mind for weeks. The question was, what does a woman in her early 50s do with 22 years of experience managing complex finances, understanding business loan structures, navigating legal documentation, and administering the financial architecture of a significant household and a growing business operation? She was not asking this question rhetorically. She was asking it the way Margaret had always approached everything, practically, methodically, with a genuine intention to find an answer and act on it. What she discovered, in the months of research that followed, was that the answer had been in front of her the entire time. She enrolled in a certified financial planning program at a university near her home, not because she lacked the knowledge. She had absorbed more practical financial knowledge in 22 years of managing David's life and their household than most formal programs would teach, but because she wanted the credential. She wanted the professional language. She wanted the institutional recognition that would allow her to translate what she already knew into something she could offer to other people, with authority, in a context that required documentation and expertise. She completed the program in 18 months, studying in the evenings and on weekends, taking her exams with the same methodical focus she had always brought to everything, and emerging on the other side with a certification that, combined with her documented experience and her intimate personal knowledge of exactly what women going through high-stakes divorces need and do not know how to ask for, positioned her to do something she had not anticipated when she first sat down in Sandra Michael's office. She opened her own practice. She called it Second Chapter Financial Consulting, and she built it specifically to serve women navigating divorce, late-in-life financial independence, and the particular kind of disorientation that comes from having spent decades managing someone else's financial life and then suddenly being required to manage your own. She knew that terrain. She had lived every inch of it. Her first clients came from her own social circle, women who had watched her story from a careful distance and who reached out privately, sometimes with a single text message that said some version of, "I think I might be in trouble, and I do not know where to start." Margaret always responded. She always made time. She charged fair rates, structured her practice around accessibility, and built her client list the way she had always built everything. One careful, well-organized, deeply considered relationship at a time. By the end of her second year in practice, she had a waiting list. By the third year, she had brought on a partner and moved into an actual office with a proper reception area and a conference table where she sat across from women in the same position she had once been in, frightened, disoriented, underestimating what they were owed, and helped them understand what she had learned. She helped them read the documents, helped them understand what their signatures meant, helped them find the forensic accountants and the family law attorneys who could do for them what Sandra and Richard had done for her. She was not a therapist, and she did not pretend to be, but she understood the emotional terrain as well as the financial one, and her clients consistently described her as the person who made them feel, for the first time since their worlds had collapsed, that they had a realistic chance of coming out on the other side. She ran into David at a grocery store about 2 years after the divorce was finalized. She would later tell Carol about it with the calm, distant tone of someone describing a thing that happened to a person they used to know. He was alone. He looked older than she remembered, and tired in a particular way, that is less about physical fatigue and more about the kind of internal exhaustion that accumulates in a person who has made decisions they cannot quite justify to themselves in the quiet hours. He saw her, he paused. She nodded. She kept moving. She had somewhere to be. She had a client meeting the following morning with a woman who had just been served with divorce papers after 19 years of marriage and did not yet understand that the signatures she had put on her husband's business documents over the course of those 19 years were potentially some of the most valuable things she owned. Margaret was going to help her understand that. She was going to sit across from that woman with a legal pad and a pen and a cup of coffee and make sure that no one talked her into settling for less than what the record clearly showed she had earned. She was going to do what she wished someone had been there to do for her, before she had to figure it all out alone at her sister's kitchen table at 1 in the morning, with a broken heart and a very good memory. That is what Margaret built with what she was given. That is what she made from the wreckage. Not revenge, not bitterness, not even justice in the narrow, satisfying, cinematic sense of the word, though the courtroom provided its own version of that. She built purpose. She built a practice. She built a reason to get up in the morning that belonged entirely to her, that no one could dismiss, no one could take back, and no one could ever again call expired. There is something that has stayed with me through every part of Margaret's story, something I want to offer you before we close, because I think it matters far beyond the specifics of any one marriage, or any one courtroom, or any one woman's particular circumstances. There is a particular kind of harm in being told by someone who knows you intimately, someone whose life you have held together with your own hands, that you are less than what you are, that your time has passed, that your contributions were invisible because he chose not to see them. That kind of harm is not a bruise. It is not even a break. It is something that tries to rewrite the story of who you are, to replace your own memory of what you did and what it was worth with his version, which was always going to serve his purposes more than it served the truth. What Margaret did in that spare bedroom at Carol's house, with a legal pad and a pen and the knowledge she had accumulated over 2 decades, was refuse that rewrite. She said, with her actions if not always her words, the record exists, the signatures are real, the work was real, and I am going to make sure that the truth of it follows me into every room I walk into from this day forward. She did not get revenge. She got the truth on the record. And then she got up every single morning and built something with it. I want to ask you something before you go. Not a small question. A real one. The kind that I hope stays with you long after this video ends and you go back to your own life and your own story. If someone tried, today, to call you expired, to tell you that your best contribution was behind you, that your value had a shelf life, and that shelf life had passed, what would they find if you made them look at the actual record? What is in your documentation? What have you been building, quietly and carefully, in the years that someone else was taking credit for the life you were actually running? Because Margaret's story is not unique in its pain. It is not even rare in its betrayal. What is rare, what I hope you carry with you, is the clarity she found in the worst moment of her life. The decision to account for everything. To refuse the smaller version of herself that David's words were trying to install. To take what she knew and what she had, and turn it, with patience and discipline, and the particular kind of quiet power that comes from a woman who finally and completely understands her own worth, to turn all of it into something that mattered, something that lasted, something that no one could ever again call expired. I want to hear from you now, because if you have stayed with me through this entire story, I do not think you stayed for nothing. I think something in Margaret's experience touched something in yours, whether it is the specific shape of her situation or simply the broader, older truth that she lived, that the people who underestimate us, who look at what we have built and call it ordinary, who decide we have peaked and move on to something shinier, those people are often making the most consequential mistake of their lives. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better? Have you ever had to rebuild after someone tried to define your value for you? And if you were sitting in Margaret's place at that kitchen table, hearing those words for the very first time, what would you have done? I want to know. The comments on this channel are one of my favorite places on the internet, and that is because of the people who show up there with real things to say. So show up, tell me your story, and if this video meant something to you, share it with one woman in your life who needs to hear it today. She will know exactly why you sent it. If you are new here, I tell stories like this every single week. Real stories, about real people, about what happens when life takes everything apart, and what gets built in the space that opens up after. Hit subscribe so you are here for the next one. Because the story I am covering next week involves a woman who sat down to celebrate her 25th wedding anniversary, and discovered, in the course of a single afternoon, that her husband had an entirely separate family living 3 states away, a second wife, 3 children, and 11 years of carefully maintained deception. And when the 2 families found each other and decided together what to do next, what happened was something I could not have written if I had tried. I will see you then.